Hello, welcome to another episode of True North, a webcast through Providence, journal on Christianity and foreign policy. And we have a special treat here today. We're going to be talking with Gilbert Meilaender, who is a Christian ethicist, now retired, and prolific writer, and just overall interesting person to talk to and to learn from. So I'm excited to talk to him and to learn what we can learn and share with our audience here today. My name is Daniel Strand. I am one of the hosts. Mark Levecki is not with us today for True North, and I'm a assistant professor of ethics at the Air War College, and also a contributing editor here at Providence. So, Gil, nice to have you with us.
Good to be here.
Great. Thank you for joining us. I wanted to start off with some questions about your career and you personally. Could you give our listeners a little short biography about where you grew up, what drew you to a career as a Christian ethicist?
Well, I sort of fell into it in a way. I went through college and seminary, and the longer I went, the more I liked going to school. It's not a bad life, really. I think I would have become a parish pastor if I hadn't gotten a good fellowship to go to graduate school. By the time I ended seminary, I was married and I had one child, so I wasn't in a position just to be frivolous. But I got a fellowship to go to Princeton University, did my PhD in religious ethics there, went to University of Virginia to teach really just on a one-year deal at the time. Though interestingly, those were the days when there were actually multiple job offers for fresh PhDs.
The good old days, yeah.
I had a couple but I went to Virginia on a one-year deal. It got extended, and I've been there for 3 years. I just gotten another 3-year renewal, but I got an offer from Oberlin College at that point, which I took, went to Oberlin, taught for 18 years. But I always had this itch to teach at some school that was more church related.
Yeah.
So I eventually went to Valparaiso University.
Mm-hmm.
So how church related it actually is probably an open question these days. It's more related to inclusion, diversity, and so forth. But taught there for another 18 years before I retired. So I figured that way I could decide which of the two hats I wanted to wear, like the guys who go into the Hall of Fame, have to decide what team hat to wear.
Yeah.
But I've been retired for a few years now. Have continued to kind of try to pay attention to what's going on and to do some writing as well. Yeah. But I sort of do it on my own schedule now when I feel like it, because I have to. So that's the short story, I guess.
Yeah. What drew you to the profession itself, Christian ethics in particular? Was there any, I don't know, was it influence? Was it just something you sort of came to? Can you think of sort of particular moment or moments or books that you read or events that kind of drew you to this as a...
You mean what drew me to go to grad school in that field in the first place, or what drew me to...
But both. I mean, to the topic itself and into going to grad school. Yeah, I guess if that's helpful.
For as long as I can remember, kind of caring about things, other than baseball and basketball. I was always interested in, I don't know what we call it, not just certainly I didn't have a sense of a discipline on ethics, but I was interested in those sorts of questions in larger questions about public and political life and so forth. Lutheranism, I'm a Lutheran and I was in a Lutheran seminary. Lutheranism does not actually pay a lot of attention. I mean, Lutheran theology, just for some complicated reasons, not necessarily good at that. But I was interested in it. And so I just, when I got the opportunity to go on to grad school, I wanted to. I think if I hadn't gotten a teaching job, I probably could have been content to sort of return to standard pastoral work. But I got it. I kept on at it. And at a certain point, you determine your being, kind of. You become a certain sort of person. And I think I was fortunate to have studied with Paul Ramsey at Princeton. He was helpful in a lot of ways, but also you got a real sense of what it meant to care about the field of Christian ethics, to which Ramsey was very devoted. And I'm not sure I've ever been able to be as devoted to it as he was, actually, but he certainly nudged me in that direction. And once I'd done it for long enough, it'd sort of be hard to do anything else.
Yeah. What was it like, the field of Christian ethics in the late 60s, 70s? I've heard kind of different takes on what it was like in the United States at the time. What was your impression of?
It was more like a field that people shared. Even back then, people were beginning to complain that it was more fragmented. There was this longing for the days of, Reinhold Niebuhr, when Christian ethicists were actually paid attention to in the larger culture, and there was already a sense that was fading a little bit. But there was still much more of that. I mean, if you look at the kinds of things people wrote, they still wrote in ways that expected the larger society to care and pay attention. And the discipline was much more cohesive. It was smaller, of course. If you think of just an organization like the Society of Christian Ethics, it was still relatively small when I first joined it. It's much bigger now. And the field has fragmented much more. It's gone in a lot of different directions. Questions that Christian ethics will always deal with. There are just all sorts of theologies of one thing or another that people pay attention to. So it's much harder to feel that there's pieces centered to the undertaking any longer, I think, than there was even. I went to grad school in the fall of 1972, and I think there was still a sense of coherence to the discipline at that time that does not really exist any longer. What all the reasons are that we've lost that, I don't know. You'd have to be a better historian than I am, probably, to be able to say that and answer that. But it has definitely fragmented a lot the years I've been teaching and writing.
Yeah. When you look back at your own personal writing, your own, just all the books that you've written a lot of books, and what are the books that you're most proud of? I know there's probably certain books that really stand out to you. What are those books, and why why do those stand out in your mind?
I'm not sure pride is the word we want to use here, Daniel.
We are talking to a Lutheran, yeah.
There are some I like better than others.
Let's use that word.
I think of people who actually know of my work, and we should never overestimate that number. Your mother and a few others. But of people who, I think what they know is mainly two things. They know writing on bioethics kinds,
Yeah.
And they know a number of essays over the years that I published in First Things years ago.
Yeah.
When I used to publish a lot in there.
Okay.
But actually, my favorites, things I like best, well, one thing is a book that was actually my second book. So it's kind of a young man's book. I suppose I wouldn't write it in quite the same way any longer, though whether I'd write it in a better way, that's an open question. But it's a little book called Friendship and Theological Ethics. It's about what people might tend to think. People think a little book on friendship. I'll be the last person to write that kind of book, I think. It's really, the subtitle is Study in Theological Ethics gets at it. I was interested in, and still am interested in, the problem of preference, which is certainly a problem in a system of Christian ethics anyway. It may not be a problem in every way of thinking. If God makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good, and you're supposed to love everybody who crosses your path, exactly what's the justification for preference in our loves? And friendship seemed sort of a perfect place to think about that problem, because some of our other special relationships, say the parent-child one, well, you fall into that and you have responsibilities and you have to act on with a certain kind of preference. Nobody has to have friends. You don't have to develop whom you show special, who get much more of your time and energy and concern than other people. You don't have to have that. So what exactly is the justification for it? So that was the question that interested me. Friendship was the way into it. And I still think it's a good book. It stayed in print. It's not making me a wealthy man, but it gets readers even today. And I think, actually, looking back, that I actually got into that subject just about at the time when there began to be interest and concern in the general question of preference, and more people began writing. There have been more written on friendship since then. So I don't think I was wrong to focus on that, even though, as I say, the book is not quite the sort of book that a person might think. Over the years of teaching, I taught a course called Friendship and the Problem of Preferential Love. I didn't teach it every year. I teach it maybe every other year. I really like it. It's actually one of my favorite courses that I ever taught. The first thing I would always say to students at the start of the semester, when we'd walk in for the first day and I'd be introducing the syllabus and so forth, I'd say, people come to a course on friendship for all sorts of different reasons. I don't know what your reasons are. The only thing I can guarantee you that whatever your reasons are, this course will not be about them. They didn't know what they were getting into. We were going to read Kierkegaard's Works of Love, which is sort of a slashing attack on preference. But I've just always been interested in it. I still think it's a pretty... The other book that I like, especially though it's never gotten many readers, for whatever reason, it didn't work. I have many more readers than my bioethics stuff, but a little book that's called, maybe the title was bad. I like these titles. The title is The Way That Leads There, which is a line from Augustine's life. I just think it's a good book. I like it. It's good to deal with somebody like Augustine, but it's not just a book about Augustine. It's a book that kind of uses Augustine and tries to think along with him about what I would call some central issues in Christian ethics. And I like that book a lot too. There are other things I've written that I like. There are a few things I've written that I don't like that much. I won't tell you them. The little Bioethics, a Primer for Christians, is probably the thing that's gotten the most readers.
What edition is that in right now?
The fourth edition has just come out. So for whatever reason, that has worked in some ways. But my favorites are probably Friendship and The Way That Leads There.
You also wrote a book on virtue, which is very interesting for a Lutheran to write on, since virtue seems to stand at odds with many aspects of traditional Lutheran theology.
That's right. No, it's a theory and practice of virtue.
Yeah.
When I was starting to teach, when I was out of graduate school, that's when there was this sort of little boom of interest in virtue. You know, the influence of Stanley Hauerwas and Alistair McIntyre and so forth.
Yeah.
It seems a little too inward looking and concerned with oneself for Lutheran theology. I mean, Lutherans get worried about that sort of thing. And it seems to focus a little too much on trying to make progress in the moral life, you know, as opposed to just understanding one's failings and the need for forgiveness and so forth, which is more the kind of standard Lutheran sort of talk. The fifth chapter of that book, The Theory and Practice of Virtue, is a chapter specifically about Luther, in which I try to show, I think I succeed actually in showing, and I think other people have made similar cases more recently, that Luther's a little more complicated on this than he's sometimes been thought, that there's several different things going on in Luther, some of which are more amenable to a focus on virtue and an attention to it. I had, when I was a seminary student, I had gotten one of my professors to agree to do a private reading course with me, in which we simply read Luther's 1535 Galatians commentary. It's his great Galatians commentary. And as I simply read, it's 2 volumes in the English, Luther's works. It's long, and as always with Luther, it ranges over sort of all sorts of things, you know, in between attacking the Pope, he talks about other things. And I had worked through that, and I puzzled over it, and I actually had continued to think about that, not write about it, but just think about it. When I got out of seminary, when I was in graduate school, and I actually puzzled over some of the stuff in that commentary for a decade. And the fifth chapter, The Theory and Practice of Virtue, was my working it out of my system. Sort of making place for, trying to make place for consideration of virtue in a Lutheran ethic, which I'm satisfied that I did. Not everybody else is probably persuaded, but that's sort of the way it goes. Yeah,
we're kind of talking about this already, but what were the major? So we talked about bioethics and other areas that you've been interested in, but what were the major issues, if you would say, that that grasped or piqued your thinking? What are the kind of some of the big issues that you could even say that go across a lot of your works, that you feel like were important enough for you to spend your time writing about?
Well, one of them, and the one that connects most closely to bio, I think, it has to do with what I would just call the place of limits in the moral life. Especially in bioethics, there has been an enormous emphasis. I mean, for some historically understandable reasons, I mean, the medical profession was a little more paternal to be probably years ago, and the growth of bioethics, one of the things involved in the growth of bioethics decisions, or at least enter into the decision making. And once you begin to go down that road, the question becomes, what are the limits to that freedom? Are there any limits to it? Are there aspects of our identity that we shouldn't consider ourselves just free to reshape indefinitely? And that connects to the question, sort of, what's the place of the body in human identity? Does the fact that we are embodied creatures, does the fact that we are creatures, put it in a theological perspective, does this place any limits on our freedom to proceed in various ways? And it's, of course, it's central in all sorts of bioethical questions. If I think I've lived long enough and have suffered enough, can I just say the game's not worth the candle any longer and be done with it? Can I produce children in whatever way seems to work and will get me the ones I want or think I'm entitled to? The beginning and end of life questions certainly raise all sorts of questions about limits, the place of the body, and so forth. So that I think is, I think if I were to bother to try to trace it through all the things I've written, I think we'd see that in one way or another, I have kept coming back to questions about the legitimacy of such limits and how we make the case for them. So that's certainly one issue and one specifically connected with bioethics that I talked about. I already mentioned before, I've never let go of the issue of preference. That one comes up in different ways, and I've continued to care about that. It's actually still an important issue in some different ways that I don't actually know quite what to do with. We have tremendous concern today about race relations and enormous problems, and colleges and universities are falling all over themselves to try to deal with this. Not always. I don't have a lot of confidence in most university administrators, to be honest. After 40 years of teaching, one gets a little jaded on that question. So do we want what are essentially segregated housing or dining options, for instance? Well,
safe spaces.
Pardon me?
Safe spaces.
Yes. In some ways, it just seems contrary to our entire political tradition. In other ways, you can say it's people always try to find those with whom they have things in common. That's what you do when you form friendships. Yeah. So that, when I don't know quite how to work that out. The whole multiculturalism issue raises it again. Mm-hmm. We do seek out like-minded people in various ways. How do we make it not very good, and it's pretty damaging? So the preference issue that I came at in, I guess what you'd call a more traditional way, with the friendship topic, preference issue has continued to be of interest to me. And of course, I still am a Lutheran in certain ways. I'm interested in how one works out what in the very old language was the relation between justification and sanctification. I've tended to use different kind of language, but if the grace of God on the one hand pardons us, which means just wherever you are, however bad you've been, pardoned, and on the other hand is empowering, which means that you're not supposed to stay where you are. You're supposed to, how do we work out that problem? I've just written an article that basically kind of returned me to those questions that will appear in a festschrift for somebody, which I can't name right now, but found myself going back to that question. So those, I think the question of kind of limits to freedom, what it means that we're finite, and what the moral importance of our finite condition is. That just pops up in various kinds of places, certainly in the bioethics stuff, but elsewhere. The preference issue and that basic fundamental question about kind of how we think about the structure of the moral life within specifically Christian theological terms. Those are probably the questions that keep popping up in my work.
We seem to be living in a time, and this, maybe every age says this, and you probably felt the same way maybe back when you were beginning your career, but maybe this is just a sort of a longer narrative, but the place of limits seems to be a really hard question, since we seem to be speaking less and less in a sort of common, received, accepted viewpoint, set of assumptions in our culture. You talked about the fragmentation. That seems to be a sort of bigger problem as the years go on. There's less and less of a sort of common national culture or a received set of assumptions. So how do you think thinking specifically from a Christian vantage point, how do you think Christians today can speak and talk and persuade, hopefully, in a culture where it seems like limits are harder to define and for people to accept?
Well, very good question, Daniel. I wish I had a good answer to it. I think that we find ourselves today at a point when we may have to kind of not worry too much about whether we're persuading or not, because it's very hard to know what does and does not persuade. Finally, it's very hard to know how these things work out in our cultural setting. We're living in a period, or we're sort of at the tag end of a period, perhaps, when Christians and churches, more generally, I think, have been in a little danger of sort of becoming affiliated with a political party, becoming a wing of a political party.
Yeah.
Understandable for certain reasons, I think. And I'm not, so I'm not just, I don't want to just bash somebody for that, but if that happens too much, then the force of the church's message depends entirely on how successful the political parties are. I think this happens in all segments of our society, both on the right and the left, and whatever else there is besides the right and the left. And the persuasive power of what the church has to say then really depends on the success of the parties to which we align ourselves. Don't know if in the long run, as I say, I think that's understandable. I don't exactly criticize anybody for it. Well, I could think of a few people I'd criticize, but it's understandable. But I just think in the long run, we need to simply try to ask ourselves, kind of, what, as Christians, do we really want to think or say about things? And I think it's astonishing how much the thought of the people sitting next to you in the pew on a Sunday, how much their thought has been influenced by things that have nothing to do with Christianity in any way. They're good, pious people. They keep coming back to church, so something good must be happening there, I trust. But if you listen to what they have to say or talk to them about various questions, their view has been shaped much more by things that have nothing specifically to do with the Christian message. I guess that's a failure of the church, though how, I hate to say that without having a prescription for doing better, and I'm not sure that I can, but I just don't think that our views are shaped very much any longer, often by the church. And that's got partly to do with the fragmentation of our culture, I suppose. It seeps into the church, which is fragmented in all sorts of ways too. Yeah. I think until we just try to, in the preface that I wrote to the book I mentioned before, the little Bioethics, a Primer for Christians, in which I take up all sorts of questions on which I claim to present the Christian viewpoint, even while being aware that all sorts of people who would call themselves Christians might disagree on one or another thing connected with the abortion or assisted reproduction or whatever. I can't quote it exactly, but I have a nice little quote from Karl Barth, which I think is from the preface to one of his volumes of Church Dogmatics. I'd have to look again, in which he says that anybody who wants to speak for the church will just have to try to be the church as best he can in his own time and place. And I think that's the task, really. And I think that we haven't been very good at that. Now, I'm kind of rambling on here, but the counter response will be that, well, people won't understand what you have to say. The Christian language is not accessible any longer in the public sphere, and so forth. I've thought about that word accessible a lot of times in that context. What does it mean to say that Christian language is not accessible in the public sphere? Are we saying that people won't even understand it? I don't think that's true. If we're saying they won't be persuaded by it, well, that's probably true in many cases, but whoever thought they would be? I think we've allowed ourselves to stop talking Christian language on the grounds that it won't be accessible. And it's really the only language we've got that might accomplish anything.
Yeah. You sound very Stanley Hauerwas-like in your prescription there.
I'm not a Hauerwasian. I mean, I've known Stan for a long time, of course, and he's an enormously influential figure.
Yeah.
He has a tendency to overstate some points occasionally, but he's not wrong to say that if the church doesn't recapture its own language and be prepared to use its own language, we won't accomplish much. I mean, and even just forget it as in terms of the work of the church in particular, just think of ourselves as citizens of a country. I'd say you owe your fellow citizens the best explanation you can give of the real reasons for your views. Yeah. Don't hide. You know, they need to know. It's true that we live in a world right now where you may be silenced if you do them. But that I think that's what we owe our fellow citizens, and Stan's been right about that.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think Hauerwas has been perhaps overstates, but I think that point he's definitely driven home to great effect.
A little hostile toward America on occasion.
Yeah. Well, it seems like his whole project. Yeah. So in closing, I wanted to ask you finally about your most recent book, which I think a lot of our listeners would be very interested in. You tend, like, you're known most for writing on sort of ethical issues and bioethics in particular, but you've just written a book on the Ten Commandments, which it has to do with ethics, but it's not a topic that is it's not terribly fashionable, let's say, right now to be writing on the Ten Commandments. And I'm just interested to hear your thinking and why now.
I don't know if I can answer the why now part of it, because I'd say sort of a couple things. I'm not sure who will care, so it's not as if I sense this enormous surge of interest in the topic to which I thought I somehow needed to respond.
Yeah.
I don't know quite what I'll think of it a few years from now. See, I know what I think of the friendship book, for instance. That's a long time ago. We'll see what I think about this book down the road, though at the moment I like it. But if you say why, there are a couple of reasons. One is that, to go back to something we've talked about before, Lutherans, contemporary Lutherans, 20th century, 21st century Lutherans, the Lutheranism in which I was instructed, have never known quite what to make of it. I mean, Ten Commandments, the Decalogue, has been very important in Lutheran catechetical instruction. Luther's catechisms, deal with the Decalogue, so forth. Lutheran theology, with its suspicions of law and worry about that, sometimes it's sort of sophisticated theology, hasn't quite known what to make of it. And so in part, it was my continued attempt to say that Lutheran theology has something positive to say about moral law that sort of lies in the background there. But beyond that, I've been thinking about some kind of book on the Decalogue for quite a long time. I mean, I'm not even sure how many years, but we're talking years. They've just been kind of rumbling around back there in my head. I actually had a little manila folder in which I occasionally tossed something, a reference that I saw, or even an idea that I had, stuff was just sitting there. And then I don't know, let's see, so it would be about, it's 4 to 5 years ago that probably that I thought I maybe would really try to do this, even though I still didn't quite have the structure of the project clear in my mind. And I think it's when I found a certain structure that the thing came together for me. I basically treat the commandments, apart from the first commandment, which is everybody, I basically treat the commandments as dealing with ways in which human lives are bound together. So there's a marriage bond, a family bond, a bond of life with life, a possessions bond, and what I call a speech bond. Those do not correlate simply with one commandment always, but sometimes with several. But I think that's what the commandments are about, ways in which human lives, in which the Creator binds human lives together. So I got that. And then I found a kind of threefold structure for the chapters on each of those bonds, which is by no means original with me. I actually took it from my reading of Barth, but you could get it in other ways also, in which so you've got the marriage bond, the created marriage bond. You've got the marriage bond in need of healing, and you've got the marriage bond redeemed, finally, or eschatologically. And once I got those two aspects of the structure, it sort of came together. And I simply tried to say what I, once again, excuse me, what I think Christians should try to say about the point of these bonds in human life. Once again, there are some things in there that I'm sure not every Christian will agree with. Sorry, I wish they would, but I don't think it's likely. But it was an attempt to sort of set out the structure of the Christian life, understanding it as a history that moves through history more generally and through each person's life. Each person's life is taken up into the history of redemption from creation to the end of times, and try to think about these bonds of life from each of. We'll see if it gets readers, and we'll see what I think of it 5 years from now, if I'm around to think about it 5 years from now. But that was the idea, to really kind of return to the Decalogue, which so many Christian thinkers have used as a way of talking about the moral life, and do it again. It wasn't an attempt to do anything particularly innovative. I think it's probably more interesting than something innovative that I would have done on it.
Indeed. Well, Gil, thank you so much. This has been helpful, interesting, and I know many of our listeners will find great value in just hearing a Christian ethicist who's spent a lifetime reflecting on these sorts of questions, and hearing about your sources, and just hearing the way that you talk, I think helps. Like you said, I think in a culture right now where we're formed by so many other sources, I think one of the reasons, at least, that we wanted to talk to you was for this very reason, is to have someone who has really absorbed and sat with the tradition for his career. And so we thank you for taking your time to share a little bit with us and for our listeners. And this will conclude our episode today for True North. I'm Daniel Strand, and we will see you next time. Thank you.